Dr. Rock, it is such an honor to have you here. Thank you so much.
Dr. Love, thank you for the introduction and the warm welcome. It's great to be here with you. And I don't know if how many times we're all able to hear that we're sad that we're not together before it gets, passe, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm sad that we're not all together, and yet it's nice to have the feeling of the connection. It's similar in some ways, for sure. Not a lot of dust on me, but definitely a lot of woods. So thanks for being here. And folks who are with me live, want you to know I'm going to kind of share some ideas in kind of bursts and then interact with you guys. So rather than talk at you for 40 minutes and then questions, I'm going to kind of share some ideas for 10 or 15 minutes and then kind of see what you're thinking about. We'll go deeper, not just your questions, but also the connections you're making and kind of what this tells you. So we'll be able to make it quite interactive. I'm not going to show you slides. I've got 2 trillion slides. I would strongly encourage you to get pen and paper out though now if you want to get the most from this, because I'm going to describe some frameworks and some constructs that will be, there you go, David's got it handled, that you'll be easier to process if you're not holding them in mind, and you'll be able to see the connections between them if you're not holding them. Yeah, so I'm going to do that, but you can use the chat if you want. I'm pretty good with the chat. I've been on Zoom for years. If you want to sort of ask a question or make a comment anytime, I've got that open. Or you can come off mute and kind of, we can have a conversation at a few specific points where I'll make that clear. I'll give you the quick summary of my journey, I guess, for context. As Dr. Love said, firstly, that's his actual real name, and this actually my real name as well. So in case you think those are player names, he is actually Dr. Love and I am actually Dr. Rock in the real world. But I've been running an organization for 22 years, following my passion for bringing science to the mainstream. And I head up really a research and think tank practice that is about 200 people strong, based in New York, London, Sydney, but really operations in 24 countries. And it's hard to explain what we do, but we make organizations better for humans with science. So we use science, real science, not pop science, but real science, evidence-based work, actual peer-reviewed academic research work. And we synthesize that science to basically advise companies on what should they do with their humans to help people be more effective and ultimately the organizations more effective. So I've written a bunch of books and lots of papers and head up a research team, and we publish big research each year on kind of how to lead and manage people better. And then that's used extensively through as he said, about 50 of the top 100 firms in the world. So, that's what I do. And I'm going to talk to you about sort of some of the central ideas that have come about around, leading through, a real crisis, whether it's a, wartime, which this sort of feels like, or a pandemic, or just an incredible amount of change. It feels like we're further on a continuum that we were already on. Most companies were already dealing with, huge amounts of change. We've just sort of gone further. So anything that sort of helps, makes us further, what do we do? So I'll share with you a couple of things on that. Starting off with kind of managing yourself and then managing others. And let me first give you a definition of leading as well. So you as a leader are leading your relationship with a partner, you're leading a family, you're leading a team of people, maybe you're leading a small business, maybe you're leading a medium or large business, but all of those are leading. So leading is, you trying to facilitate change, influence others, and all of that. So I'm not just talking about, oh, you're not a, you're a CEO of a big company. No, leading is leading in any of those contexts. And leading pandemic edition is particularly interesting for a bunch of reasons. So I'm going to talk about kind of what's going on in our brains and what we can do personally. And then I'll talk about what we can do to kind of help each other as well, but kind of starting with ourselves and understanding our brain. So firstly, one of the things with a crisis is that we have to think really, really deeply, but also we have to think really, really differently. We actually need completely new ideas for responding to a situation like this. We need to think really, really deeply. And a lot of that is actually insight thinking. It's thinking that is about kind of the breakthrough coming from our unconscious into our conscious. We also need to do some pretty deep rational thinking, like scenario planning, and really, really imagining the different scenarios and kind of working through scenario A, scenario B. So both creative thinking and linear thinking is really, really taxed in a crisis. And unfortunately, what a crisis does is dramatically reduce both of those right when you need them most. And we end up being much less capable of really responding adaptively. And there are two ways that we can respond maladaptively. And I think it's helpful to understand this pendulum. If you're going to draw, you might draw a sort of an arrow, a horizontal line with an arrow at each end. And on the left, you've got basically downplaying a situation. So sort of under arousal. So not really thinking this is serious right now, not really focusing on it, not really caring about it. It's not really adaptive in this situation. To some degree, you could say there are certain situations where it could be, but being completely in denial would not be adaptive. You would be hitting up against some big problems. Trying to fly without wearing a mask, for example, doesn't tend to end well. So it's not really adaptive to just be in complete denial. And one of the things that happens in complete denial with a crisis is you're basically not motivated to think deeply. There's no reason to. Why should I care? So there's no motivation to do the deep thinking or have the insights, right? The other end of the spectrum is over arousal. So you've got under arousal and over arousal. On the far right, you've got over arousal. And over arousal is basically catastrophizing, right? It's like, watching CNN constantly, getting constant alerts, constantly watching the data. And that's also not adaptive. And that's not adaptive because now, in the first case, you didn't want to think. In this case, you can't think. So in this scenario, over arousal, you literally just don't have the resources to actually think well at all. Certainly even to think decently, never mind think about, the really, really difficult things that we've got to do. So in those situations, it doesn't work. What you've got to do is stay in the middle. And it's a delicate balance. And the best metaphor I've had that's helped me and others is personified by the Stockdale paradox story, which is a story told in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. And it's a real story about a Navy colonel that survived a real crisis, a prisoner of war camp. In fact, he led that prisoner of war camp. He was kind of the most senior person in that, and he helped folks through. And what he found was that people at either end of that pendulum I talked about didn't make it. And the people who made it had a particular kind of point of view, a particular mindset in the middle. And what they had was basically they actually had this quiet belief that eventually it was going to work out. Like every couple of times a week, we all have that. Like we go, oh, actually, there could be some positive things out of this. Maybe in the end, it's going to work out. Maybe it'll be a year or so, maybe 2 years, but it's going to pass. We're going to get to a point, 2 or 3 years. So we're going to look back, be amazed that we survived and proud of what we did and embarrassed about other things, but we're going to look back and feel okay, So you get those moments. So he says, you've got to hold that. You've got to hold this belief that eventually it is actually going to work out, and keep reminding yourself of that kind of quietly. But then, and this is the cognitive backflip, then you've got to actually accept the brutal reality of how hard it is at the moment. And that's really important. And this is sort of difficult. There's a tension in holding those, right? So eventually it's going to work out. Actually, it's going to be brutally awful till then, like really keeping your expectations low. And then the third piece of this that's super important is now do everything you can to make it even the tiniest bit better. And find what you can control, because a sense of control is hugely, hugely central in how overwhelming a stress response is. So right now we feel completely out of control. And then when we find what we can control, whether it's like, oh, wow, I can control my exercise way better than I ever have any other time in my life. Amazing. You're doing it. You're controlling it, actually feeling better. But whatever it is you can control, you start doing that. I'll give you the 3 components again. A belief that things are going to turn out in the end, eventually, could be years. It's a quiet belief, real clarity that's going to be awful till then, and really looking at the data. And then the third thing is doing anything you can. And that middle state is the only place in which you can actually think deeply. It's really impossible to think deeply if you're basically catastrophizing or underwhelmed by the whole thing. You need to be kind of in that middle state. So that's important. Now then, what you do in that middle state though, like how you stay calm, is really important. And I'll give you this next piece, and then we'll pause and kind of take your comments. But how you stay calm then in this state is important. So what's happening is we've all got kind of self-regulation strategies or stress management strategies for kind of like 2-foot waves, right? I like to surf. The last decade or so since I've been in the US, I snowboard more than surf, but I surfed for like 20 years. So still have a lot of those metaphors. So, you can surf in 2-foot waves, and every now and again a set would come along, which would be like 4 foot. And so you've got strategies for that, right? You've got strategies for duck diving and for big set comes, you're in or out. But then suddenly a wind comes up, something happens, and you're stuck out the back, and suddenly it's like 6-foot waves with 10-foot sets. And your strategies don't work anymore. You've got this like stuff coming at you that's completely different level. And that's kind of what's been going on for us. We've all survived different intensities of experiences, but unless you've lived through a kind of war zone, literally, we haven't built the capacity to deal with what's been coming at us. And so we need these regulation strategies. And the simplest one to build, or the most important one to build, most important self-regulation strategy to build, is essentially not getting overly stressed, because once you do, you basically stay there for a long time, and it seriously debilitates you. So it's kind of what you do before the stresses hit you that actually matters the most, versus what you do once they're there. It's kind of avoiding them is the key. So let me give you some language, first of all, just to kind of distinguish what's happening in our brain, the different stresses. There's basically 3 different types of threat response we have. So we have a threat response or a reward response to every situation. There's some really good research on this, that the threat response is not like a continuum. It's actually a series of different zones that we have. And the first level is something we experience all the time. We just call it level 1 threat. It's basically you're alert but not alarmed. You're like a tiny bit anxious, but everything's fine. And in fact, you're more effective at kind of simple work in that state. So simple work meaning like you're not better at creative work in that state. Creative work is better, neutral or positive. But like kind of process work or having to focus or having to do something you do well, a slight threat response literally shrinks your focus, has you be right here, right now, and get that project finished. So a level 1 threat is adaptive, for good, it's fine. The problem is level 2 threat, and level 2 threat is your brain doing this whole Boolean like processing thing of real mortal danger could be imminent. Like the chances are high enough that you should actually prepare all the biological systems that take time to warm up. So your cortisol levels, your reduced stomach digestion, reduced brain digestion, which is prefrontal. All these things take a little time to warm up in case you're going to need to, run or fight. So the oxygen to the extremities, the motor cortex fired up. All this stuff takes a bit of time. So the brain says, look, just in case, like danger has become that much more likely. Just in case, we're going to prepare all that. That's great. The downside is basically everything intentional is now less adaptive. So anything that involves like paying attention, to incoming stimuli or holding information in mind or regulating emotions, all of that actually diminishes. And all the oxygen and glucose, not all of it, but good amounts of oxygen and glucose goes out of your prefrontal into basically limbic systems and motor cortex and other things. And so what's going on basically is you're preparing for physical activity, which is now better, but all cognitive activity is worse. And you don't necessarily notice that. You just feel kind of alert. You feel really alert and slightly alarmed. And that's what's going on. Now, the third level is the one we've all heard of, but the second level is the insidious one. The third level is the amygdala hijack. That's where you're actually at full tilt threat, right? So, level 1 is hearing about a hurricane, off the coast, maybe heading to your town, but it's fine. Level 2 is, the hurricane's going to hit you in the next 24 hours. Level 3 is the hurricane, overhead. So, literally you can't think at all. And so what's happened in this crisis is that, we were surfing, simple threats. Now we're surfing these really big threats. And our normal strategies are we're just ending up at level 2 and level 3 threat many, many days a week. We sort of wrestled it down. Most people have wrestled it down. But as a leader in particular, actually you need to stay neutral. So you need no threat at all and even positive. So, and you've got even more threats coming at you in the form of even more uncertainty and more like demands and more people watching you. So you've got even more threats on top of the uncertainty going on. So you basically need really strong strategies for maintaining yourself at no more stress than level 1. And kind of the best way to do that is put in buffers that catch it early or stop it happening. And the 3 areas that matter most are around certainty. So you got to put in buffers around certainty. So like stop watching the news and creating this kind of addiction to that actually decreases certainty. Minimize that. Create order around you, actually create structures and systems so that you hack your brain's distance bias and that you're creating certainty around you. And really get into some routines and some structures. So you've got a lot more certainty than you're used to. So that's the kind of buffer that I'm talking about. Autonomy is another one. autonomy is a feeling of control. So you've got to work on what you now can control. So yeah, you now can't control a bunch of stuff, but actually there's a bunch of stuff you can control now, like your diet. You know, if you're home a lot, your diet, your sleep schedule, your water, hydration, it's all this stuff, you know, who you see, you could really control lots of things you've never been able to. And so as you focus on that, you actually are able to bring yourself back to more of a positive state. And the other one is relatedness, which is connection with others. And the more you actually work on that and, you know, turn this time away from, wow, I'm disconnected to everyone, to, wow, I'm having hours of conversations with people intimately I never used to have. The more you can, like, you know, create that deeper sense of relatedness through this time, the more you're offsetting that. So certainty, autonomy, and relatedness are in the brain, they're not dissimilar. They're on the same continuum as like oxygen, water, and food, in that when any of these reduce as resources, you get an alert response that says, you know, your resources are dangerously low, pay attention. So certainty, autonomy, relatedness all are they activate the primary threat network when they're reduced. In a similar way as physical pain, in similar way as thirst, similar way as hunger, all of these are basically your body saying, you know, your chances of survival have diminished if you don't pay attention to this. And so you got to pay attention to it. So that's the cliff note. I'll pause there, but that's the cliff note for, you know, for people who are leading, whether it's leading your partner, you know, relationship, even just leading yourself, but in particular leading a partner, a family, leading a team, a small organization, a big organization. You have a lot to process. You got to process much deeper than ever before. Your ability to process deeply is directly proportional to how much threat you have. And what you've got to do is manage that threat ahead of time in many, many ways. So let me pause there. You can put a question in the chat, or you can come off mute. I'll see you if you come off mute and say, yep, let's chat. But questions, or just like what's coming up for you, what's this reminding you of, or, you know, comments you have. It'd be nice to have some interaction there before we go to the next chapter. CK, good to see you.
Good seeing you, Dr. Rock. Thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom. You dropped so many gems. Super amazing. You have just such depth of knowledge. So my question for you, my friend, is this. As a leader, let's say I am now self-regulated. I now need to hold space for others to self-regulate. What would you say would be your strategy as a way to somebody who's freaking out and make their life zone 3 or somebody's zone 2 to really help them calm down and get back to the center?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for joining us from the dojo. I love that background. That's great. It reminds me of my Hapkido days. It was a lot of fun. So it's a great question. Look, the first thing is we automatically biologically resonate with other people's emotions, and in particular, people who matter to us, either their higher status or their authority figures or they have control over us. Like, we automatically resonate with their emotions, right? And if if you're important to someone, right, your emotional state is basically additive to theirs. So if you're like neutral and they're slightly anxious, you'll bring them up a bit, right? If you're positive, not completely Pollyanna positive, but just, you know, like generally slightly happy and they're slightly negative, you'll bring them up, right? But what happens on the negative side is if you're already like at level 1 threat and they're at level 1 threat, actually you'll both go down, or certainly they will. Right. So it's kind of weird the way it works. If you're in the positive, you'll sort of bring them up, but if you're in the negative, you'll take them worse. And so there's an automatic, you know, action that happens. And that doesn't answer the bigger part of your question, but I want to start with that. So actually your state and illustrating your state, demonstrating your state is actually really important, you know, like exemplifying it, demonstrating it with speed of breath or speed of talking or whatever, right? That's one thing for sure. The second thing is, once people are at a high, like at level 2, right? Now we've got some great language. Level 2 or level 3 threat are really important to be able to recognize. So level 2 is like, you know, they're still pretty coherent, but they're definitely frazzled. Definitely like something's really up, right? Whereas level 3 is like they're not making a lot of sense. You know, they're really, really, really agitated, can't focus. So, you know, someone's at level 2 or 3, they often need a biological intervention at that point, because basically a cognitive intervention won't work, because the part of their brain that basically activates a cognitive intervention is in the prefrontal. It's the right and left ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, literally like the temple, right and left temple. and all the oxygen and glucose has gone out of that prefrontal during a threat response, especially a level 2. And so you're trying to like activate the brakes, but there's no like, the brake line is gone from the brakes, right? You can't pump the brakes. And so often what you need is a biological intervention. The best thing often is like feeding someone. Like, when did you last eat? And often the answer is, oh, like 5 or 6 hours. Let me feed you, right? Or let me bring you a warm cup of tea. Just, stop whatever you're doing and let's just eat for a bit, right? Simple, right? Or, can you have a lie down, or can you take a walk? Let's take a walk together. One of my favorites is, let's take a walk together for a while. That backfired like nothing else yesterday when I took my daughter, 13-year-old, for a walk in the woods, and I accidentally stepped on a wasp's nests, and we both got stung up the wazoo and ran home literally a mile with the wasps following us the entire way, stinging us all the way to the freaking house. And we both now have level 3 threat. So there was no talking sense to us during that time. It was like, here, let me swat you, was about all I needed in that time. That's the intervention I need. Please pick up a log and swat me. I remember saying that to my daughter at one time. Take this log and hit me, please. And I had to ask her 3 times. So that, when you're really at that level of threat, true story, welcome to Burning Man. This was yesterday before the opening. When you're in that level of threat, there's no talking sense to the person, right? So it's like, what can you do to actually calm them down? Don't try cognitive strategies. But the cognitive strategies work at a level 1. One of the best ones is labeling what's going on. So let me just let's put some words on what's happening for you. That works well at level 1. People don't predict that it will. They think it'll make things worse, but it does actually make things better, as long as it's not rolling into venting. But labeling actually does work. It actually reduces that prefrontal to limbic response, and it goes back the other way. Or reappraisal is really helpful. Reappraisal is changing your interpretation of the situation and looking at it a whole other way. But those only work at level 1 threat. Great question. Anyone else, the question or comment on kind of taking care of yourself? And again, for those coming online, we're talking about, when you're leading, whether it's with a partner or a family or a team or a business, when you're leading, you have to be able to think really deeply and also really flexibly with insight thinking, which is really inhibited by the stress response. So we need to actually the most responsible thing to do is take care of ourselves really, really well, so that we're actually not experiencing any stress at all, that we're actually optimistic. It's a super responsible thing to do, to be slightly optimistic, just slightly, during this time, to bring people up. Any other questions from folks coming online? Or CK, you got another one?
Could I ask a follow-up question about, so you said that you had someone hit you with a stick after the wasp started chasing you? Is that what you asked your daughter to do?
Yeah.
I don't understand that. Why?
Well, I couldn't ask her to hit the wasp with her hand because she would have got stung. So there were wasps on me.
Oh, I see. There
were multiple wasps on me, and I couldn't find anything to hit it with. So I grabbed a log and I said, please hit me with this log.
Thank you for underlining that. So quick question about the level.
She's listening in the background and laughing, by the way. So
the level 2 question about basically getting to the body, right? What would you say something drastic like an ice bath or an ice bucket dump or something like that? Would that be? Well,
I mean, that person could see that as a tremendous threat. So you have to ask them, would be getting you an ice pack feel like a positive thing or a negative thing? And the person should have like a lot of choice in that, like that sense of control and autonomy. And when we choose something, we bring it closer. So yeah, you can definitely do things like that. But what's a reward for you could be a threat for others. And also if you're making it happen, then it can be a threat. But if they're choosing, it can be more of a reward, right? So those things are really super important. So give people a few wonderfully smart options to choose from. Can I get you a meal, an ice pack, or a hug? Pick one. Would you like me to help you find a place to nap, or a person to hug, or should we put some music on and dance? What's going to help you the most to settle down, in this time? So that's the best strategy, is give people some smart options that all could work.
Thank you so much.
And it's a question from M. Tambo, firstly, and then I'll go to David. So I don't know your full name, but I have M. Tambo.
Dr. Rock, my name is Millie Tambo. I follow you. I've read your books. I'm so excited to be here. And so I just wanted to see if you can talk more about the cognitive strategies, because I really love what you wrote about the labeling, the reframing. It really works for me. So share more about that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Millie. Thanks for being here. So, so they're two different things, right? Labeling and what's called reappraisal, but they both activate a similar network or a similar process in the brain. They both activate the brain's braking system, braking, and they turn the brakes on, which turns down the limbic system. It's like a seesaw. Labeling does it a bit, reappraisal does it more. And so the thing with labeling is labeling only works with relatively low threats. So for a stronger threat, you tend to need reappraisal. So labeling is essentially you've got a sensation. You don't have any words for it. That brings a bit of uncertainty and lack of control, right? So your certainty and autonomy is down. And it's just kind of the feeling of like, I don't know what's going on, creates noise in the brain. And then you go, oh, actually it's 2 o'clock and I haven't eaten. I'm just hungry. And then in that moment where you kind of realize or put words on what the sensation is, this whole map gets created of like, oh, okay, that's okay. I know how to control this. Now I know what's going on. I can predict what to do and you feel better. So essentially labeling is putting a few words on a situation, not a ton of words. That becomes more like bringing the emotions up. But when we just summarize an experience, like literally no more than 2 or 3 words, when we summarize an experience like a label on a box, we create this increase in certainty and autonomy. And it creates this calming, okay? And you can do it at any moment. I mean, there's an element of mindfulness practice that's like that. We can do it at any moment. Just, you're walking along, something's kind of feeling weird, and then you go, oh, okay, there's a bunch of things in the background that are like going on that I have sensations about. It's, I'm sad I'm not at Burning Man. I'm still itching my finger from the bites yesterday. I'm wondering how my daughter is enjoying this lecture. It's the first time she's heard me do one. Like there's all these different kind of things. And as I label each one, it kind of frees up that space, right? So that's what labeling is. Reappraisal is basically, it's getting a little deeper. So, do you remember the old days, like decades ago when we used to get on airplanes? My experience often at an airport was, I was often kind of last minute, and I would, if I can't see the gate, if it's like 30 minutes before and I can't see the gate, my heart's up. And then at some point I see the gate, I see the long line, and I'm like, okay, I'll be fine, right? But 30 minutes before, there is a chance that it'll be busy and you'll be fine, but there's also a chance there'll be no line and they could leave without you. And just that feeling is really interesting. So anyway, so basically what happens is you have an emotional appraisal to every situation. And, whether it's the kind of, whether it's the line at the airport, or it's, what your partner is going to say to you this afternoon, or how am I going to deal with this pandemic tomorrow? You have this emotional response to every stimuli, right? And what reappraisal is doing is basically hacking what happens when you notice that line at the airport. When you see there's a long line, your body goes, oh, okay. And your heart rate goes down. You've got new data that says you're not really in danger. And so basically reappraisal is hacking that system, and it's changing how you see the situation so that your whole neurochemistry actually changes. And there's really good neuro studies on this. Kevin Oxner at Columbia has done this, and based on James Gross's original research on emotional regulation, and shown really conclusively that when we change our interpretation, the whole biology changes, both the cortisol levels, the braking system, all this stuff. You can be looking at a photograph of someone in a hospital that looks like they're, really dying. And then the professor says, actually, they were much worse yesterday. They're really on the mend now. This is actually them looking good. And as you hold that thought, your whole response changes, your whole chemical response changes. Or you see people that are crying and you think they're, at a funeral, and then you zoom out and you see, oh, actually they're at a wedding, tears of joy. And you're like, oh, and you have a different response. So often it's kind of taking a broader perspective or a different context, or seeing it from another human's perspective. So as you change perspective in some way, it changes how you see the situation, right? And that changes your emotional response. So that's what reappraisal is basically. It's literally changing how you're perceiving the situation, and it literally does change the biological response that we have. And I think it's really interesting. There's a work by, I'm scratching a lot. There's work by a number of scientists. Lisa Feldman Barrett is really interesting on emotions. basically there isn't really a signature emotion until you put a word to it. Like there's no signature for like anger in the brain or overwhelm in the brain or sadness in the brain. There's no consistent signature. It depends on what word you actually have for it, and the frame you make around it. And so the framing that we have really impacts the biological response in many, many ways. Great question. Anyone else on yourself? We can continue on this path for sure. Oh, David, you had a question. Thank you for reminding me.
I think it might be dialing back a little bit, but I was just curious, in stress situations, the actual changeover into a leadership position or taking a leadership role in a group, is there something around the negotiation of that or how that happens? Is there a need for one leader, or is it a response, whoever responds, or is there, I'm wondering if there's anything around that actual role definition and the transition.
That's actually great. That's a nice transition. And you're welcome, Millie. It's a nice transition to where I wanted to go next. So I sort of said the first half of this, and look at that, we're halfway. The first half of this will be about you, and the second half will be about kind of how you help others, right? So let's summarize the first half with stay neutral to positive by putting in buffers. And if threats come along, label and reappraise. Strong threats come along, take a biological action so that you can minimize it, right? But what about others? So firstly, really, really interesting, this whole question of, do teams need a leader, and why does leaders, why leaders exist, and what happens when you become one, all of this stuff. There's a lot of research on that. Systems are more adaptive and responsive when there is a clear hierarchy. So or said differently, when there's no clear hierarchy between two people or a team, there's actually this weird like dysfunction that happens. There's this jostling for hierarchy, like it's uncertain. And then when there is a clear hierarchy, systems, two people or many, actually are more adaptive. Now you can play with it, you can alternate it, people in some realms have fun with that, but it's interesting. It's an interesting thing. Now, Cameron Anderson did a lot of work on this. He's at Berkeley. On kind of power and status and all this stuff. And there's some really good neuro work as well. But basically, we really, really do care about our status compared to other people's. In fact, we actually, with everyone we interact with, we actually unconsciously determine their status and our status and who's higher. And in fact, there are 3 different brain networks that light up according to the strength of the differential in status. And I'll say that again, 3 different brain networks that light up according to how different your status is. And then these different networks determine all sorts of things that happen next. In summary, are you, deferential, or are you more expansive, right? Dominant, submissive, you can use different words, but there is like a, toward or an away response, right? Which is threat and reward, as mentioned before. It's all the same continuum, right? So, what's happening here is systems where there is a clear leader tend to be more adaptive when there isn't a clear leader at all. Now, we can get into all the sort of social psychology on that, all sorts of other things, but just from a neuro perspective, which is more my work, the brain does crave that certainty of who's in charge from that perspective. Now, what happens when someone does become in charge? We wrote a really interesting piece on this. We actually did some research. And when I say we, my team's about 200 people, lots and lots of cognitive scientists and researchers and others. And we worked for about a year on this question. There's this really interesting thing that happens in the brain to someone when they gain power. And let's talk about that. I think it's really topical. So essentially, a little bit of power goes a long way, both bad and good. And when I say a little bit of power, it's like you're working with 4 friends, you're all, working in a company, and now one of you has been told you're a little bit in charge of the others, right? You're going to just kind of make sure things get done. That's all it takes, just like a little bit of power over other people. Some really interesting things happen in the brain in basically 3 categories. And we wrote about this. I'll see if I can point you. It was in Quartz magazine. I'll see if I can point it to you if it comes into my head, the name of it. But basically 3 things go on in your brain. The first one is that you start perceiving humans as concepts, not humans, right? So there's 2 ways we can perceive other humans. We can perceive them in their fullness as people with like intentions and goals and emotions, and we can have unconditional positive regard, we can hate them, doesn't matter. The basic thing is we're really thinking of them as a human. Or we can conceptualize people and think of them as literally concepts, right? Now, what happens when you when you basically have a little bit of power over people is you start thinking of them in a utilitarian way. And you stop thinking of them as people that have, you know, emotions and intentions and, you know, all that. And you start thinking of them as you know, as kind of pawns that you can use in some way. Now, there's adaptive value to that, because taking the data out of your, you know, when you're trying to hold a human in mind, holding all their intentions and goals and stuff like in mind while you're thinking about them, and then trying to add another person and another person, and like holding all that stuff in mind and then trying to work out how to, like, you know, organize a project, like your working memory is completely full. So it actually makes sense to kind of go to a stripped back model of the human, right? When you're trying to like put humans together on your mental stage and you're saying, hey, human A, human B, human C, who should I pair to do this project? You just don't have the actual working memory, the stage space, the mental stage space to hold all that. So what we do is we basically kind of get a straw person concept. So now we have this straw person of a human, a straw person of a human. Now we can move them around faster, right? We can sort of, a little bit like the way, you know, in a graphic design program, you know, a simpler image can be moved faster because there's less recoding of all the data. Does that make sense so far? So what's happening is we basically think of people as concepts. The upside of that is we can think much faster and deeper and wider about lots of people and work out what to do with them. The downside of that is we completely misread how people will respond. And so that's the first thing that happens is with a little bit of power even, it's really interesting. And the second thing is around risk. So the first one's around people, the second one's around risk. What happens with a little bit of extra power, you basically downplay risk, and you start just being very optimistic. Now it's partially because a little bit of status actually creates a reward response. So feeling higher status than other people activates the reward networks in a similar way to beating your personal best at something, you know, also creates a reward response. There's a reward response in the brain for being better than either yourself or other people. Both, by the way, are just representations in the brain. But there's this reward response for being better than another human. And what happens is we've got this slight positive response, right? A slight status reward. And what goes on is that we sort of laugh off the risks. Now, again, this is a double-edged sword. So this is actually important because leaders have to do really difficult things that are actually scary and uncertain. You know, what's that saying? You know, how you know, like leaders have to do something that basically they have to see things no one else can see, right? They have to see things no one else can see, and then keep like imagining them and keep like believing that they're possible, and like, you know, like literally seeing things other people can, you know, can't see. Do you know what that's also called? Crazy. Like people literally think that you're crazy sometimes. Like, I don't see that, right? I know you see that the business could look like that. I don't see that, right? I literally haven't got the mental model of that. You're crazy. So you're dealing with this thing of like seeing things other people can't see, right? Which actually creates a status threat for you now. So now you've got this status reward to balance out the status threat. So again, adaptive, this risk thing, right? But then maladaptive because you don't take it, you know, you don't pay attention to actual downsides and you make mistakes. And the third one is details. So people, risk, and details. The third one is details. So basically what happens, a little bit of power, is that your level of construal goes up. Construal is level of abstraction plus meaning. So you're basically lifting up from like, you know, from like, this is low construal is, you know, lifting an object. Higher construal is drinking. Higher construal is making my voice sound clearer so you can hear this easier, right? So higher construal is more abstract plus meaning. A little bit of power, you start thinking much more abstractly, much less about where you actually put the drink down and much more about staying, you know, quenched to speak well. And so you miss the details, you know, the thing drops off the table. I'm terribly guilty of this one. I think very high level quite often, and I, you know, stumble into trees and do all sorts of things because my mind is often very kind of up in the clouds thinking about the future of leadership and all this other stuff. And so I miss really important things in the details sometimes. So people, risk, and details, basically you have an effect on all those three things. That's what even the smallest bit of power does. And it's a real issue. Great. Is that good? David, is that a thorough enough answer there? Great. CK, you've got another question there. Please, anyone else, just know you can ask a question or just make a comment in the chat, or you can also come off mute. And if you're willing to go on camera, it's nice to see people. It's lovely to see people. Thanks to those who've been willing to do that. Oh, there we go. Some more faces. Thanks very much. So CK, what actionable tactics do you have to navigate co-founder dynamics? Yeah, interesting. You have some startup implosions. Yeah, the challenge with like a startup, the co-founder is there is a real jostling for power, right? Like a partnership between two people, even that is really difficult from a power perspective, because the power changes as one person has more money or more resources than the other. And like, power is a really challenging dynamic between two people. When it's between 3 or 4 people, it's really difficult. And often what you're jostling for is really a status question, is who has more power, who has more responsibility. I mean, the one thing I can say is, is be labeling these things as much as you can. Be like recognizing and labeling these things early before they become, really fraught. And take these things seriously. The power dynamics, when someone feels like they're in the shadow of someone else and they shouldn't be, it becomes a real issue if it's not kind of identified and brought out. Social pain, like feeling someone else is higher status than you and shouldn't be, like, it's actually very painful. It activates the same network as physical pain in the brain. So social pain is actually something to take really, really seriously. So watch out for the sense of unfairness. That's a type of social pain. And watch out for the sense of like reduced status when you thought it should be higher. Those are 2 really social pains. Now, I talked to you before about certainty, autonomy, and relatedness. Now add status and fairness to that, and put the S at the start and the F at the end. I'm just doing a giant puzzle for you. And you have a word, and the word spells SCARF: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And SCARF is kind of, if I was a musician, SCARF's my double platinum album of kind of an idea that's like turned around in people's heads, literally millions of people's heads, that literally is like a frame that helps you see the world at a different level. And so SCARF is essentially the 5 things that are driving threats and rewards all the time, in particular strong threats, like a feeling of low status or unfairness or all this stuff, right? And with all of these, I went through certainty, autonomy, relatedness before, but status I've explained, fairness is literally just a sense of equity. With all of these, the threat is stronger than the reward. And what's really strong is multiple things in a threat state. So if you have all 5 in a threat state, then you have a really, really strong response. And in particular, people of color in the last few months have had, long-term status reduction. Now that's felt even worse, right? Also, even more uncertainty and even less autonomy, and even more disconnected. And then this enormous dose of unfairness. Watching some of those videos just was unbelievably animating. And so you had all 5 in a very strong threat, and now you have people feeling what feels like inescapable pain and willing to do almost anything to heal that pain because it hurts so much. So that's the negative jackpot, not a positive thing. And that's an awful place. And we want to do everything we can to help anyone in that negative place to, find a way out of that that's healthy and safe, because it literally is painful. And, there's a whole bunch of studies on this. The sense of unfairness you have correlates to your health outcomes right across life. By entire states and entire countries. Sense of equity and equality in that correlates to positive health outcomes for everyone, including people with resources. So that's a whole other conversation that one day someone might shoot me for bringing up, but there we have it. Great question, CK. So SCARF, let me get back to then the punchline. So SCARF is a way of thinking about how you interact with other people. So as a leader, people are already in a threat state. Maybe their status is down because they're feeling like they're not capable of this thing. Their certainty's down because life is crazy, right? Their autonomy's down. All these things are kind of down. So what can you do? So the question is, how do you put in a positive signal? Which one of those domains can you put a positive in? It's status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. That's the frame. If you look that up online, you'll find a million things about it. The best reading is probably a piece I wrote called Managing with the Brain in Mind. It was in Strategy and Business magazine. That's kind of the best summary. But, leading in a time of crisis, or, the Neuroscience of Leadership Pandemic Edition, the cliff note there is send positive SCARF signals everywhere you can. Now, what does that look like? For status, just reminding people how they're winning and actually that they're doing okay, and that, because we're feeling down on ourselves. for certainty, you can't actually increase certainty, but you can go a long way by increasing clarity. And it's non-obvious how big an effect that can have. And the smart companies are doing that right now. Like Microsoft back in April this year said, all in-person conferences, events, meetings, everything are canceled until July 2021. And this was in April, and everyone's like, wait, what? That's ridiculous. Like, why don't we wait and see? Actually, it wasn't just prescient. What it did is it created a huge amount of clarity for people. And now everyone could actually prepare for the worst rather than be, in this space of what's going to happen. Ambiguity is uncertainty, and uncertainty is debilitating. Whereas when you create clarity by saying, nope, that's done, that's off the table, it's actually freeing up resources, even if it's bad news, right? So you can create clarity by defining things. You can also create it by timelining, right? So I could create some clarity for you right now by saying, the first few months of this was basically shock. It was psychological shock. It was called acute distress disorder. You then, in the last few months, have been in a stage of pain, and probably in a year's time from now, you're going to be in rehabilitation. So exactly like you've broken your leg, you had a stage of shock, a stage of pain, and a stage of rehabilitation. And you're still in the stage of pain, and you should basically do whatever you can to mitigate that pain because it's going to last a while, right? I've just helped you create clarity on a timeline, right? And actually it gives you a frame, right? So you can create clarity by taking things off the table, by creating a timeline, or by going back to your principles. Like, look, there's craziness coming at us. Here are the 3 principles we're going to keep working to. Help the humans, manage our safety and love each other or something. So what are the principles we come back to? Again, you create clarity. So that's what you can do for certainty. For autonomy, it's all about giving people more control, letting people make more choices. In the organizational settings where I am, I'm just telling, thousands of managers to give control to their employees every way they can over what they work on, how they work, when they work, where they work. Just give them much more control than you've ever been comfortable with. And it will really, really help people through this time. Relatedness is all about shared experiences, people feeling heard, and shared goals. So shared experiences and then shared goals. So bringing people together. And then fairness is, about really treating people as individuals and really listening deeply to drive fairness. So that's the cliff note on what we've got to do as leaders, and, hear these threats and then identify what you should do to move people forward. All right, let me pause there with presenting. We've got 12 more minutes. Let's take some questions or comments or connections you're making. What's coming up for you? No question is a bad question.
Dr. Rock, last year you talked about the neuroscience of insight, and that's one of my favorite things. And I'd love it if you'd give the cliff notes of that, about being in a positive state, so we can have insights and the power of that to help us have insights in the time of pandemic, in the time of theoretically fewer options.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dr. Love, for asking. I opened with that somewhat and just said, during this time, you need the insight phenomena as well as you need deep rational thinking, and both are inhibited. But let's go a click further into that. So essentially, you have this working memory capacity. We all have this working memory capacity, which I call a stage. It's like actors going on a stage. It's quite limited. And literally, you can't do much more than add up 4 digits in your head before it starts to be really dysfunctional, which is an extremely small amount of data when you think about it. And so complex questions, which just about every question right now is complex, actually requires your non-conscious resources to solve them. So you need basically your unconscious brain to solve the problem and put it into your conscious brain. The trouble is, the noisier your brain is, AKA higher threat level, the noisier your brain is, the fewer insights you have. And there's a whole body of research on this. I wrote a whole other book on this called Quiet Leadership, that looks at kind of how you bring people to insight. But the basic mechanism is that when you ask your brain a question like, what time should I finish work today? The deeper regions of your brain do start activating. But essentially, if there's a lot of noise in the brain, then it's a very dysfunctional kind of search. So imagine like a big, kind of almost like a Google search in the deep regions of your brain. The noisier your brain is, the noisier the search is. And more importantly, the signal when the answer is found is a quiet signal. So when you come up with the answer, it's a small number of neurons speaking to each other quite often. Often the answer is in like a distant memory or something you read once, or a solution you found once, or a conversation you had once, right? So when we hit a problem we can't solve logically, the answer is often buried in our memories, which means that it's a small number of neurons speaking to each other. And the spike that puts off, those small number of neurons, the spike that puts off is basically quieter than the noisy signal of our stress right now. So it's like a quiet cell phone at a loud party, right? When we used to actually see other humans thousands of decades ago. So that quiet signal at a loud party is basically the insight phenomenon. So the more you can do to quiet your brain, and not just threat, but literally less activity overall. So it's basically about helping you notice quiet signals, the tickle at the back of your head, the sort of hunch that you have. It's a very subtle signal. And basically, you know, downloading all your emails first and having all that in your head wipes it out. So one of the techniques you want to have is leave insight space early in the day and early in the week, especially early in the week. Like try not to schedule anything at all on a Monday till like lunchtime or later. And try to leave your mornings open before you do your emails for things that are urgent, or not urgent, but things that are creative. Like tackle your creative questions before anything else when your brain's quietest. You know, writing questions or anything that's really stumping you, like tackle those things in a novel way, like by taking a walk, before you kind of make your brain full of noise. That's basically what goes on. So there's a lot more to say about that, but if you look up just David Rock insight, or how to have more insights, you'll see a bunch of my writing on that. There's a bunch of stuff free online on all that. So that's really what's going on. Deanne has a question. Deanne, do you want to, thanks, CK. Yeah, so there's a lot of really interesting stuff on insight. And the basic hack is anything you can do to help your brain notice quiet signals is really, really helpful. And one of the things that, and you'll sort of notice this, you know, if you play a game on your phone, like a word game, for example, and you get stuck, leave it for 5 minutes, come back, you find the answer, right? The brain has got quiet down, sees the information fresh and sees the pattern. So it's basically let the deeper regions of your brain solve problems for you. Great. Deanne has a question. And then thanks for coming on camera, other folks. The question is, what does a leadership model look like in collaborative conscious communities? It's a great question. I think they have a lot more labeling for a start. I see a lot more honesty about what people are really feeling, what's going on. So I definitely see a lot more of that. As something, you know, something really interesting to me coming into the Mystic community. So I'd never been to Burning Man before. I've been a Mystic 3 years running. I missed last year. It was a tragedy in itself. But before that, I was there 3 years running. And, you know, I found it really confronting the first few days when I was there, because I've kind of spent a lot of time in my life. This is going to be embarrassing and a bit of self-disclosure, but I spent a lot of time in my life, like working really, really hard to basically have luxuries, and I wasn't born into them, but, you know, I really, really like my driver and my seat at the front of the plane and my suite at Four Seasons and all that stuff, to be honest. And I really like those things, and that's where I spend my life. And I was like, I've got to do what? I've got to like, hang on, didn't I just pay money? And I would never say that, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I definitely struggled with that for like a few days. Like, can't I pay more money and not do that? Like, I got lots of that. And I was like, I was really struggling with it. And there was something about the equal status. Like, there's definitely some leadership, and I love the leaders of the camp. I just adore the way that Genevieve leads and all the other leaders. I actually learn a lot from them. They're doing an amazing job. But there's such a kind of shared goal, like a strong relatedness. So there's a really strong relatedness in terms of we're all in this together, and the status is not played up. The status is really neutralized. And there's this incredible sense of fairness as well. So they really value relatedness and fairness. Looking at SCARF, they devalue status. Status is off the table. Certainty, who the crap knows what's going on moment to moment, right? Certainty's out the window. Very high on autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So you know, everyone's got a lot of personal choice, but we're all in this together with a goal, and we're going to be super, super, thoughtful about fairness in every way. That's what I see in conscious communities. They're really anchoring on the A, R, and F in that way. And I love the work they do. And every year I go and I get something different, and I'm reminded of that I'm a human like everyone else, and I do my chores, and I also go and play bongos, which is awesome. Thanks. Yes, the Mystic leaders are truly awesome. Got 5 more minutes. Other questions? What would you like me to dig into? Dr. Love, you said you had some questions. I'm sure you've got some.
You answered my question about insight. And frankly, my brain is kind of processing what it is that you've shared and how I can implement this in my life. Like SCARF is so powerful. And I recently, I met a young lady who's very, very smart and who I've been collaborating with. And she and I are kind of like bumping up against each other because we haven't established any sort of status hierarchy. Right. And it's fascinating. I'm like, man, I'm really not getting along with this person, but like, she's beautiful and intelligent. I want her my life long term, but we're just like, there's no status at all. It's fascinating how it's creating this friction.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a status battle for sure. You should talk about it and maybe each have higher status on different things. So, you have final say on that stuff because you're just really smart at that. Maybe I have final say on this stuff. And because I'm really smart at that stuff. And so that can be one way to do it. So there's no absolute status between people, but there's status that's relative to different issues. Yeah.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I see really smart power couples like Annie and Eben, who are two leaders in our camp. They have a lot of conflict. And they're both, and they say we're on equal status. And I think that creates challenges because I don't know if they've differentiated, but they share their conflict in their work together because they work together a lot too, which creates conflict. I think that differentiating status in different places is really helpful.
Yeah, it's a great question. CK is asking me, how do I cultivate the quiet times in my life? It's only with a hyperactive mind. Actually, bongoing does it. That's my favorite thing of all. Bongoing really quiets my mind. I can't really hold a thought. I mean, I've been playing drums since I was a kid, so I completely can lose myself with my eyes closed deep in this pattern. But I can mind wander a little bit. But I really love the feeling of being immersed in this really like 8 layers deep of patterns and hearing the space and the music. And, so I lose myself in that. Snowboarding, I try to get like 4 or 5 snowboarding trips a year to really kind of get quiet. I love that. And just walking, long walks lately, long walks in the woods. Although those are on the back burner right now after, for those who hear this whole session, after the experience. Something that I deeply enjoy, something that I'm really immersed in. I try to meditate most days. I always fall asleep afterwards, which I've made peace with. And like a little meditate and a 10-minute nap, 15-minute nap is amazingly refreshing. And the science of that is you come back up to full brain. But physical activity for me is really the thing to kind of, I come out of physical activity with a quiet mind. So that won't work for everyone, but for me, that's really the thing. Any final question? I've got a couple of quick announcements. Any final questions? Just thank you for being here. Just a couple of closing things. I've written a ton of stuff online about everything that you've just heard. So if you and almost all of it free. So if you Google David Rock and any topic that you're interested in, like David Rock SCARF, you'll see 50 million pieces. Or David Rock Insight, any of the sort of topics, reappraisal, all that stuff. Got a big blog at neuroleadership.com, hundreds and hundreds of posts, more organizationally focused, but neuroleadership.com, all free. Tons and tons of blogs on diversity and inclusion and habit, and changing cultures and, more the talent management and leadership development world. So tons there. I've got a blog at Psychology Today that's got a couple of hundred posts on kind of more personal things, including all sorts of weird and wonderful things, Psychology Today. And then I've got a blog at Forbes that's more about kind of organizational stuff. So just David Rock Forbes. And I write there every week or two. We wrote a big piece on kind of what leaders need to do in this crisis right now, which is listen deeply, unite widely, act boldly. So we've got a bunch of that, those are some places, depending on what you're interested in there. I will also say, I know I'm not allowed to make any commercial things, but I will give a gift to you and say my team is hiring, and you'll see that all at our website. But we're 200 people and growing and making organizations better for humans through science. That's our world. So if you know any wicked smart people, either yourself or others who are wicked smart, passionate about complex systems and science and have some skills, send them our way. But thank you for being here. Wonderful to have you here. Dr. Love, thank you for facilitating this. You and I should chat and some one of these times, and wish you a wonderful rest of the burn.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Rock. Happy burn to you. And I hope to play with you in the, I hope to listen to your bongos in the Mystic Verse or in the Infinite Playa. We have the capacity to listen to those that are nearby inside the multiverse. Really? I hope to hang out with you in there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care of yourselves and look after each other. Take care.
So that was a great kickoff to our day here on self-development.